Welcome back to Gold Rush Reporter. Today, we're diving into a warning from the International Monetary Fund that should set off alarm bells for anyone watching the global financial system. The IMF reports a growing trend. More nations are moving away from the US dollar and embracing the Chinese yuan. This isn't a small shift. This is a tectonic change, and the numbers behind it are staggering. China has increased its lending capacity by over $2 trillion in just the first 9 months of this year alone. Washington knows this. Countries are being drawn into Beijing's orbit with the sheer power of its financial firepower. The US dollar is no longer the unquestioned backbone of the world economy. Political instability, tariff conflicts, and trade disputes have eroded global trust. Meanwhile, China offers stability, lenient loans, and lower rates, making it increasingly attractive to nations seeking security. Let's look at the scale. In the first 10 months of 2025, China issued approximately 15 trillion yuan in new loans, roughly $2.1 trillion. That's not just a domestic stimulus. China is using this massive financial reach to push the yuan into international markets, linking other nations' economies to Beijing instead of Washington. Every swap line, credit extension, and offshore loan strengthens the yuan's influence while simultaneously weakening the dollar. Take Latin America as an example. In May 2025, during the SELAC China Forum, Xi Jinping announced a 66 billion yuan credit line for the region. Over 100 projects in energy, digital tech, and infrastructure are now pegged to the yuan. Beyond finance, China is controlling strategic ports, supply chains, and trade networks, creating long-term leverage that the United States struggles to counter. This is no accidental strategy. It's carefully calculated. From dim sum bonds for offshore fundraising to massive swap lines with countries like Argentina, China is building an alternative global financial system. Meanwhile, the US is scrambling, offering swap lines and support packages. But nations increasingly turn to China for reliable finance. And it's not just Latin America. Across Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe, countries are testing UN-denominated trade and finance. The IMF's warning shows just how urgent this shift is. Global reliance on the dollar is eroding, and central banks are quietly adjusting their reserve ratios. Many are increasing gold holdings and reducing dollar assets, a clear sign that confidence in Washington is waning. As we continue, let's zoom in on how China is quietly reshaping global finance, while the US struggles to maintain its grip. This isn't theory. These are real numbers, real deals, and a real shift in power. Over the last 5 years, Chinese banks have spent more than 3.4 trillion renminbi, almost $480 billion, on bonds, deposits, and external yuan lending. That's not just lending. It's building a parallel financial infrastructure completely independent of the US dollar. At the center of this system is CIPS, China's interbank payment network. It allows countries to settle trillions of dollars in trade directly in yuan, bypassing SWIFT and the traditional dollar-dominated system. Why does this matter? Because nations under pressure, from sanctions, high interest rates, or currency instability, now have an alternative. They can borrow, trade, and transact in yuan rather than dollars. It's not subtle. Countries like Brazil and Russia are already using yuan settlements for commodities like iron ore, soybeans, oil, and gas. That's billions of dollars of commerce bypassing the dollar, strengthening China's position while weakening Washington's influence. The shift isn't confined to trade. Central banks themselves are reacting. In 2025, data shows a growing number of them are reducing their dollar reserves while increasing gold holdings. About 73% of central banks plan to lower dollar exposure, and 76% plan to increase gold reserves in the next 5 years. For the first time in decades, gold holdings are surpassing US Treasuries in many national portfolios. This isn't cosmetic. It's a signal that confidence in the dollar is fading. Meanwhile, the US is reacting. Washington is attempting to patch cracks, offering swap lines and emergency funding, especially in Latin America. Argentina is a prime example. Even as the US attempts a $40 billion combined support package, Argentina continues deepening financial ties with China through yuan-denominated loans and infrastructure deals. Trade and finance are increasingly aligned with Beijing, not Washington. Every yuan loan, every credit line, every infrastructure project is a strategic move. China is creating a system that ensures long-term reliance on its currency and financial framework. The US dollar, once untouchable, is facing a gradual but unmistakable erosion of trust. In short, the IMF warning isn't alarmist fluff. It's a wake-up call. The world is pivoting toward yuan and gold, and the dollar's supremacy is no longer guaranteed. The global financial shift we're witnessing is more than numbers. It's a tectonic realignment of power. Central banks, hedge funds, and nations are all recalibrating their strategies. The dollar's dominance, which has held for over 50 years, is under serious threat, and gold is becoming the ultimate safeguard. Let's start with physical gold. Central banks aren't just talking, they are buying. Massive purchases from China, Russia, and other BRICS nations have pushed global demand to levels not seen in decades. This isn't speculation, this is history repeating itself. When confidence in fiat collapses, hard assets like gold surge. Central banks understand this. While the US clings to treasury dominance, the rest of the world is quietly converting reserves into tangible assets. The implications for US debt are alarming. Treasury yields are climbing, and global appetite for dollar-denominated debt is shrinking. If demand falls, the US will face higher borrowing costs just as trillion-dollar deficits continue to expand. Every dollar printed, every emergency swap line, only temporarily masks the deeper structural vulnerability. In parallel, China's yuan-based credit networks expand, offering cheaper alternatives to nations otherwise reliant on US lending. Infrastructure and trade are key tools in this strategy. In Latin America alone, China controls or has stakes in the majority of major ports. That's political influence layered atop economic leverage. Combined with yuan-denominated swap lines, these deals tether entire economies to Beijing rather than Washington. The result? The US loses both leverage and influence in its traditional backyard, and the dollar's strategic utility diminishes. Digital finance is accelerating the shift. China's digital yuan enables faster, cheaper cross-border settlements than the dollar-based system. ASEAN countries, Middle Eastern nations, and even parts of Africa are testing the rails, bypassing the Fed and SWIFT entirely. This is not experimental, it's structural. Every transaction in yuan chips away at the old order. Even the IMF's warnings confirm the gravity. Central banks are increasing gold reserves while reducing dollar exposure. This dual approach, holding hard assets and diversifying away from dollars, is deliberate and coordinated. By the numbers, global confidence in US debt is eroding, and gold is the hedge against systemic risk. For investors, this is crucial. The next few years will reward those who understand that gold isn't a commodity, it's strategic currency. Physical possession, proper allocation, and timing will define who wins and who loses as the dollar's hegemony wanes. The erosion of trust in the US dollar is now measurable. Central banks around the world are quietly reducing dollar reserves while increasing their gold holdings. This isn't a minor adjustment. It's a seismic shift in global finance. Nearly 3/4 of major central banks plan to cut dollar exposure over the next 5 years, while more than 75% intend to increase gold reserves. The implications are massive. Let's break it down. The dollar's decline is not just about trade deficits or political instability. It's systemic. Years of reckless debt accumulation, aggressive money printing, and unpredictable policy decisions have created an environment where the world no longer sees US treasuries as a guaranteed safe haven. Confidence is eroding, and the fallout is already visible in higher borrowing costs and lower foreign demand. At the same time, China is capitalizing on every opportunity. Their yuan-denominated credit lines, swap agreements, and digital payment networks are creating an alternative financial ecosystem. Nations tied into these systems become increasingly reliant on Beijing rather than Washington. Infrastructure projects, ports, and energy deals are being funded and executed in yuan, further embedding Chinese influence globally. Every transaction bypassing the dollar chips away at US economic control. The US response has been reactive. Swap lines, loans, and emergency financial arrangements are attempts to stabilize influence, but the effects are limited. Argentina, for example, illustrates the paradox. US assistance continues to flow. Yet, the country's alignment with China is deepening. Trade and finance are increasingly conducted in yuan, and these patterns are spreading across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. For gold, this is a perfect storm. As confidence in fiat currencies weakens, demand for tangible assets skyrockets. Central banks, hedge funds, and sovereign wealth funds are accumulating physical gold at unprecedented rates. The COMEX and London bullion markets face mounting pressure as investors demand real delivery rather than paper promises. This squeeze on physical gold creates the conditions for a major price revaluation. The takeaway is clear. Gold is no longer just a hedge. It's becoming the cornerstone of global financial strategy. Its role as a store of value is being reinforced by real-world demand from central banks and nations seeking stability. Meanwhile, the US dollar's diminishing dominance ensures that gold's importance will only grow. We've reached the tipping point. The global financial system is moving fast, and gold sits at the center of this transformation. Central banks are no longer passively holding dollars. They're actively reallocating reserves, buying gold, and embedding themselves in yuan-based systems. This isn't theoretical. It's happening right now, in real time. The US dollar, once unshakable, is losing its grip. Countries are diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets, and with each yuan loan, swap line, or infrastructure deal, Washington's influence weakens. This erosion of confidence affects not just trade, but global power. The dollar's decline is feeding inflation, increasing borrowing costs, and exposing structural weaknesses in US fiscal policy. Gold, on the other hand, is benefiting. Its role as a strategic, tangible reserve is being reinforced globally. Central banks are buying aggressively, physical deliveries are rising, and traditional paper-based systems like COMEX and the LBMA are under strain. Investors no longer trust promises on paper. They want the real metal. This growing demand, amid limited supply, sets the stage for an unprecedented revaluation. Meanwhile, China's strategy is methodical. By promoting yuan-based finance, digital payments, and physical gold accumulation, Beijing is creating an alternative system that bypasses US influence. Nations participating in this system become economically tied to China, reducing reliance on the dollar. Infrastructure, trade, and credit are all strategically leveraged to expand Chinese dominance, while simultaneously undermining the dollar's global role. For those paying attention, the signal is unmistakable. the world is shifting. Gold isn't just a hedge against uncertainty, it's becoming the ultimate reserve asset. Prices are poised to rise as real demand clashes with limited physical availability. COMEX outflows, London vault pressures, and central bank accumulation all point to one inevitable outcome. Gold will reclaim its status as the true global standard of wealth. The critical question now is how prepared you are. The dollar's dominance is eroding, global trust is shifting, and gold's strategic value is climbing. Those who understand these trends and position themselves accordingly will have a decisive advantage. History shows that when fiat currencies falter, tangible assets prevail, and today, gold is that asset. Stay vigilant. Watch the flows, track central bank moves, and focus on physical holdings. The world is changing rapidly, and this is the moment to act before the next wave of financial upheaval reshapes the global order. Gold is no longer just a commodity. It's the foundation of financial survival in a post-dollar world. The opportunity is here, and those who recognize it now stand to benefit the most.